The seed planted wouldn't grow if God didn't make it grow. The seed watered wouldn't grow unless God made it grow. Just as in the physical realm, those who plant and water can get no results without God's power. In other words, if I planted a big crop of corn and came up with a harvest, maybe 120 bushels to the acre, that's quite a bit generally, at least in North Carolina it would be. In the States, I think in Illinois, it can go up to 200 bushels to an acre. But still, if you got 200 bushels to an acre, could you brag and say, hey, look what I did? Well, no, because God makes the corn grow. And that's what Paul's saying here. You and I don't need to brag about, like, if there's a baptism, brag on the person baptized and on the Lord who made it possible for them to be set free from sin. Don't brag on you, because you didn't do it, God did. Both Paul and Apollos worked toward the same goal. And that's exactly what he talks about here. They're one, they're united in their purpose. And their purpose is to help these Christians to become what they ought to be. They were striving for their faithfulness, in other words. Now he goes on, in verse 9. For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field. You are God's building. Okay, look up the word fellow workers. What is that word? It's in 3:9.
Synergos.
And what does it mean?
Work with.
Work with. So fellow workers with God, or fellow workers in God's service. The context indicates Paul is speaking about the equal relation of God's workers with one another. They're all working with God. I'm not better than you, and you're not better than me. We're all working with God. Jet teaches a class, Damien teaches a class, Andres teaches a class, but who gives us the ability to do that? God does. And that's really the primary emphasis that we're seeing here. So notice he says, you are God's field. What about that word field? How would that be translated?
Cultivated land.
Yeah, exactly. So when you think about it now, remember he's talking about planting, watering, and God bringing the increase. So here we got cultivated land. Who cultivated it?
God. Or the workers.
I think the workers did. God brings the increase. Their job is to cultivate, to put down the seed, put down the water. God brings the increase. But he's saying you're God's field. You're not. The field doesn't belong to Paul. The church doesn't belong to Paul. The church doesn't belong to Gary. It doesn't belong to Damien. Doesn't belong to Jet. Doesn't belong to Andres. Doesn't belong to us. It's God's. You're God's field. You're God's building. Now you choose a different word. What does that word mean? You're God's building.
I see part of that word comes from the word house.
Oikodoma.
But it gives a definition of edification.
Because, yes, sometimes it means that. I don't believe it means that here. Edification means to build up, like building a building, okay? So here, he's not talking about edification. He's talking about you're the building belong to God. Now, think about Corinth. Remember when we were doing the introduction? How many different temples did they have? How many different gods did they worship? So when they thought about Aphrodite, they probably thought of the temple, don't you imagine? Because it was her temple. Okay, here Paul comes along and says, you're God's temple. And he's going to, by the way, he's going to emphasize that in verse 11. He's going to get much more specific with that idea. Sure, you're God's building. And so the glory belongs to who? Well, it belongs to God. You belong to him. You think about these great racehorses, for example. The trainer gets a little bit of credit, but the owner gets the bulk of the credit. It's their horse. It's not the trainer's horse. The trainer's just an employee. The owner owns the horse. If the horse is, wins great championships and somebody sells it, it's not going to be the trainer. It's going to be the owner. So you got a little bit of that here as Paul writes. So in Psalm 115, verse 1, we find, not unto us, O Lord, not unto us, but to your name give glory, because of your mercy, because of your truth. So who does glory belong to? It belongs to God. It doesn't belong to me. It doesn't belong to you. We're God's tilled land, and we're God's building. Well, he goes on, verse 10, and he says, according to the grace of God, which was given to me as a wise master builder, I have laid the foundation and another builds on it. But let each one take heed how he builds on it. Verse 11, for no other foundation can anyone lay than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. So Paul used his spiritual gifts to lay a foundation in Corinth. Apollos came along and he built on the foundation. But the reality, again, is the same as we've already seen in verse 9, and that is that it all belongs to God. Who's the foundation of the church? Not Paul, not Apollos. Jesus Christ is the foundation. So he warns the people building on the foundation, be careful how you build. Why? The building belongs to God and the foundation's Christ. And you don't want to build incorrectly here because of that. Christ is the rock foundation of the church. You think about Matthew chapter 16, when he says, upon this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. By the way, that Matthew 16, we probably need to look at that. It's misused a lot by people. You remember he comes to the borders of coast of Caesarea Philippi, and he asks, who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am? And what did they answer? You don't have to give me specifics. What's the basic idea?
Like a prophet?
Yeah, a prophet. Yeah, and they name different ones. When you think about it, they say, well, some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, some say Jeremiah, and some just say, well, one of the prophets. Maybe they don't know what you want, but a prophet. Now, but what is the subject here? In this Matthew 16, what's the subject?
Matthew 16.
Yeah, because we're talking about the foundation. Matthew 16, beginning verse 13. What's the subject?
Who Christ is.
Who am I? Who am I? Yeah, who is Jesus, right? Okay, so keep going. Verse 15, he said to them, but who do you say that I am? What's the subject?
The content of the conversation, you mean?
Yeah, what's the subject still? Has it changed?
No.
So the subject is still, who is Jesus, right? Is that right?
Yes.
That's correct.
Is that right?
Okay, so now watch. Peter answers, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus answered and said to him, Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you. Wait a minute, this what? Who am I? I am the Christ, the Son of God. And how did Peter come to know that? Well, Peter on the day of Pentecost explains it, doesn't he? Jesus of Nazareth, the man approved of God among you by signs, wonders, and divers miracles that he worked, right? How did he know that Jesus was from God? He was the Son of God by the miracles that he worked. That's how he knew that. And so the subject is still the same. Who am I? I'm Jesus. I'm the Son of God. Okay, so he goes on to say, he says, Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood is not revealed to you, but my Father who's in heaven. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I'll build my church. But what's the subject? The subject's not Peter. Peter's not the rock. The rock is that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. What's the foundation of the church? Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And that's what Paul is saying right here in our text today, 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 11. Peter, in fact, told the Sanhedrin, there's no other name by which we must be saved. That's in Acts chapter 4, verses 11 and 12. No other name under heaven given among men whereby we must be saved. That's what he said to the Sanhedrin. All right, go ahead to the next couple of verses here, 12 and 13. Now, if anyone builds on this foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each one's work will become clear. For the day will declare it, because it will be revealed by fire. And the fire will test each one's work of what sort it is. Now, that may not make a lot of sense to us. But what were the buildings of Corinth made of? What did they use to build the buildings in Corinth? The exact things he lists.
Silver.
If you're talking about a temple, they use silver and gold and precious stones. What about if you're talking about somebody's house? Wood, hay, straw. See, right? So how's it going to be tested? Well, they knew exactly how it's going to be tested. Rome burned, right? Well, Rome wasn't the only city that burned, but Rome burned. And Paul said your work's going to be tested. Is the building material good material or bad material? Well, we're going to know in the day of judgment, aren't we? Paul's work is going to be tested in the day of judgment. And that's basically what he's saying. McGarvey says the building materials Paul mentioned here are very familiar to the brethren at Corinth. Gold, silver, and precious stones were used to make idolatrous temples fireproof, while wood, hay, and straw were used in building combustible huts in which the Corinthians lived. The best should go into the church, knowing the quality of materials or individuals. Christians will be tested in judgment with weak combustible material found unacceptable. Trials are used by God to test the quality of the material in each of us. How does God know who I am? Well, he tests me. How does he know who you are? He tests you. And we're going to find out whether you're going to hold up or not hold up. Based on what? Based on the tests that come in life. Some people, you think about the parable of the sower again. Remember, some of the seed fell on stony ground, rocky ground, came up fast. But what happened when the sun got hot? Withered, died. Other of it came up in the middle of weeds. And what happened? The weeds choked it out. Isn't that showing what it's composed of to some extent? What its nature is? I think it is. A little bit different terminology, but I think it's the same basic idea that we're looking at. All right, so verse 15. If anyone's work is burned, he will suffer loss, but he himself will be saved, yet so as through fire. So Paul is basically saying, all you Christians in Corinth may get burned up in the day of judgment. And that'll hurt me. That'll be a loss for me. But Paul will also be tested, and he can be saved if he's a good material. So my salvation doesn't depend on the preacher who preaches to me and calls me to obey the gospel. But on the other hand, it works the other way around, doesn't it? He's not going to be judged based on what I do. He's going to be judged based on what he does. So the apostle could say, basically, he can be saved, even though all of the people he taught are lost. He could still be saved.